Bam.
This is James Rosebush, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk to you. We have a mutual friend, Robert Hunter. You guys are neighbors. Who knew? I didn't know that when I met you guys individually. It's like, and I think you said, "Oh, he lives across the street from me." And I love that that this happy accident happened, and that we have two brilliant minds in foreign policy, but you guys don't reside on the same side of the political spectrum. And I guess I want to start right there. Is do we have like everybody loves diversity until it goes against what they believe, right? And so, do we have a political diversity problem in our foreign policy?
Well, I want to go back to Robert Hunter, who is now one of my best friends, and we agree a lot and we talk a lot, which is more than I can say for a lot of partisan politics today. We need to be able to talk to each other in a way that's not inflammatory or destructive, because it isn't personal. We're all Americans. We want to see not just America, but we want to see the world succeed. And we have a lot of complex issues, and it relates somewhat to this book that I'm writing now, which is called The Rise of Politics and the Decline of Leadership. So many decisions today, Pete, I believe, are made for political purposes. So many decisions regarding our relationships with other countries around the world. There's a lot of what I would say show casting. There's a lot of decisions that are made and communications that are made for to earn votes or not. And I don't think that is in the best interest of our country. I think it's very important that we have a two-party system. I think it's very important that we can debate issues. I think that it is important that each side listen to each other. But of course, the history of the United States has been fraught with people, even in the earliest days, with very strongly held opinions, with even pistols on the floor of the U.S. Congress. So I think we need some perspective to begin with, that partisan politics are a part of a strong democracy. We need discourse. We need to not always agree with I'm not going to say our adversaries, but our partners in governing. And we need to be able to listen to each other and weigh it in a way that is not necessarily free from partisan politics, but at least in a way that we can hear each other. And so this is to go back to my friendship with Robert, who is an eminently qualified person, having held many responsible positions in government. We are, in fact, when you asked me, I think, to be on I think I had already been on one or two of your shows, and you said, "Hey, let's. What would you think? I think we're going to join someone else to our conversation." And I said, "I thought that's great." And so then you mentioned the name of this individual, and you didn't even know that he lives across the street from me, and that we had some, not acrimonious, but we certainly had clearly divergent points of view on things. And so I just assumed that Robert was a person that I was never going to be a close friend of. And guess what? Today we are. And we talk to each other. I think it's a really nice outcome. So you get the credit for that, Pete. And I'd like to see you get credit for more friendships like that. I think we need to, and I think certainly we need to be open to hearing what the other side has to say. I think there are governments around the world, we could name some of them, where that do not, and these are countries that consider themselves to be a republic or a democracy, and yet they don't tolerate at all opposing points of view from whatever the party is that's in power. I think that it's very important to have an adversary, or to have a group, or have opposing points of view. Let's put it that way, because I think it strengthens your leadership. So it reminds me of when we would prepare President Reagan for these massive, we don't have these anymore, but they used to be in the East Room of the White House, massive press conferences. and maybe you're old enough to have observed those, or maybe even been a part of them. And they were quite formal, but also at the same time, there was sort of a gotcha. The what are they going to ask? And also there was a really kind of humorous thing that the last person to speak, so the dean of the White House press corps would always open and then close, let's say after an hour, and she would stand up and she would say, "Thank you, Mr. President," and that would be the end of this massive press conference. But and there's another interesting story about that. But I think that the journalists who were in those massive press conferences were poised to ask the president challenging questions. Well, I think that makes a better leader. Reagan had to be prepared to be able to answer those complicated questions, and in fact, he rehearsed to prepare for that. So, in the family theater of the White House, we would a couple of times during the week, when there would be a press conference that would be coming up, there would be players, people on the staff that would act as if they were representing a particular media outlet, and we throw questions at him. And it is a good way. It's just like going to the gym and toughening up before you have a tennis match or something like that. You need to be fit, and you need to be able to respond in a way that is not only meaningful, but is going to answer the question to the extent that you can. But I'll just tell you a funny thing about the end of that. So if you remember how these were played out, the staging of it, the theatrics of it, the president walked through the press corps to a dais, which was on the east wall of the East Room. And it would be, handsomely turned out, it was on a podium, all that sort of thing. And for a long time, the president, being a gentleman, the way he was, Helen Thomas, who was the dean of the press corps at the time, when she said, "Mr. President, thank you," there would be people, one more question. And Reagan was, as a gentleman, he heard if someone wanted to ask him something, he stayed, and it turned out, it could be another 15 or 20 minutes. And so I won't. Well, I think Mike Deaver had this idea. So he turned the podium around where the president was speaking, so that his back was to what's called the cross hall. So all he had to do was, instead of being concerned about turning away from someone or a group of people that were shouting questions at him, he would just say, "Okay, thank you." He would turn around and exit down the hall, rather than having to walk through the press corps, because that would be, in fact, he could be held up for a long time, because he would want to answer the questions that were being shouted at him. It was an interesting little piece of staging that just turning him around so that he could exit gracefully and end the press conference is interesting. Anyway, I won't go on about those, but I think we're talking about this subject of being able to communicate with opposing points of view in a way that's productive.
One of the things that I've learned in my time working overseas and then studying what I did and what other people do is there's not really a check and balance on the State Department. And so when they pick something 25 years in the past, like they like snap a chalk line, anything on this side is bad, anything on this side is good. If they're inaccurate with that plumbing of a line, man, it creates a lot of problems. And they are never able to back out of that and say, "Hey, gosh, we might need to soften this stance," or, our ideology is not aligned with their nationality. And so we have these problems that become intractable because, heaven forbid, the State Department be wrong. And then the other thing I want to add into this is, and I'm going to be really hard on State Department people because they want this responsibility, so they get checked. And the checking here is once they leave the State Department, they go to the Atlantic Council. They get funded by foreign billionaires to do things. And it's like, how do we do a better job of foreign policy when we have such a locked, ossified system of State Department people?
Well, of course, foreign policy is established by not just the State Department. So, you have really the people that are really developing and managing foreign policy are really in the National Security Council in the White House. So that's where the president's policy is really generated, no question, with consultation with the State Department and the Defense Department. So you have, and beyond that, you have intelligence, the intelligence services, and so forth. So it's a complex, and it's interesting. They would show pictures of people in the Situation Room, right, during a particular urgent, like last weekend, and so forth. So you see the group assembled there. So you'll see the military, you'll see the CIA represented, you'll see the State Department, and so forth. So these are all people who have something to say about the decision, which is usually comes about because you've deliberated with all of these different branches of government, and then the president is the person who's going to be actually making the final decision and making it known to the rest of the world. But these issues are I would say, organizational. So if in the case of Israel, for example, you have a lot of different considerations that are both diplomatic, they're security oriented, they are military, they're all the different, and especially you'll see of course, at the Defense Department, there are people that are playing out different options all the time. So if we take a particular point of view, this may happen. If we take a particular point of view, then if we adopt that strategy, then this could happen. And you see this increasingly because you have a shift in alliances in different parts of the world right now. So you see, for example, South Korea. Now we just had Japan, who made a state visit to the United States. So the relationship between the U.S. and Japan is fomenting in a way. Okay, so but you have what's the position in terms of South Korea? What could happen? And I'm talking about in some instances parts of the world where there are much smaller considerations that could have a bigger impact. So in these major theaters of conflict that you have underway now in the Middle East, there are actually probably a half a dozen different conflicts going on. So how do you parse that? And a lot of it has to do with testing and playing games about, okay, if we take this move, if we make this move, what kind of impact is it going to have? And I think that you have a lot of, when you're dealing with some features in the Middle East, you're going to also be hit with surprise. It's not necessarily going to go the way the Defense Department has been gaming it, and it's hard to tell. I think the same thing also with Russia, because you're trying to actually game a leader in Russia who is also trying to figure out where he is going to effectively make his next move as well. So it's all, as I started this conversation, it's much more about politics today than it is about policy. And I think that that's dangerous, because when you have people who are making decisions based on a partisan platform or a particular political point of view, I think that's what we see with Ukraine right now. So the situation in the Congress in terms of support for Ukraine doesn't have a particular, I think there's obviously a political point of view, but it hasn't been, I don't think, well explained or justified what that point of view is when it appears that we need to be supporting Ukraine in a significant way because we need deterrence and we need to support the American people. And remember, one of the most important things, I think, as Reagan explained and felt this very strongly, but it's very logical, you build up your defense and your military not to go to war, but to prevent going to war. Right. And that to me is one of the most logical policy points of view that you can ever have. So why would we reduce our military spending now? Why would we not increase it? Why would we not have the number of ships that are basically necessary for us? Why wouldn't we be spending? Because the principal responsibility of any government is to protect its people. Now, how do you protect the American people? You have to do that by building a strong defense so that there is the threat of hurting the American people on the part of a foreign source is not a possibility. And I think that this, in some way, this idea, as I say, has been put aside at the cost of political platforms, rather than just answering the question, how do you defend the American people and the American homeland? How do you protect that? That's your one job that you have. Yeah. And that to me is absolutely tantamount to any responsibility that a senior military or a senior government official has, whether you're in the Congress or whether you're in the administration or you're heading an agency. Your job is to protect the homeland and to protect the American people. And how do you do that? You have to show the rest of the world how decidedly committed you are, not to politics, but to the principles of this country and its well-being, economically, militarily, and every other way. That is your job. And that's to me one of the most troubling things that I see today. Again, the move to a political platform rather than a policy platform. And I see my very good friend Robert has joined us now, and I'm sure he would have a lot to say about this as well.
Welcome, Robert. Why don't you say some things? I'm sure you've listened into what we were talking about.
Well, apologies, but I've had gremlins on my computer. It must be something with politics, because our good friend James is literally across the street from me here on the good East Coast, as opposed to the left coast where you are.
Junkie, right?
Mr. Rosebush, Pete. Now, can you bring me up to speed, and what can I add to, I'm sure, the wisdom that you've already heard?
So Pete, throw him a real difficult question. I want to.
Okay.
What's the question?
Something complicated.
Well, we were talking. I was talking about the responsibility to check and balance the State Department most recently, and the people who get into that career, whether they're right or wrong, they get to continue to advance. So we see the current team that's running our foreign policy. They don't have a lot of success in conflict zones in their wake. But here they are, and then they go work for the Atlantic Council and other places that are funded by foreign billionaires. How do we do a better job of reliably going in the right direction with our foreign policy? How do we look, we do a lot of things right. We're talking, I don't know what the number is, fellas. You guys tell me, but let's say that right now, 92% of what we've got going on is pretty dang good. May not be perfect, but we can work with it. But we have all this chaos to the east of us, and some level of chaos we have to be able to withstand because other countries have a say. But when we pick the wrong people, when we pick the wrong idea, when we pick the wrong outcome, we have crazy things like America buys oil from Asia and Africa and doesn't spend its own. So we export our pollution, export our production at a human cost that doesn't make a lot of sense when we have it here, right? And so these things are like, why are we doing these things? And so what checks and balances the State Department and helps them to improve their outcomes? Because it seems to me, from being on the tactical end of those things, there's a lot of arrogance, not a lot of listening, and there's probably too much politics.
Well, I disagree with you on one point. It's not that we get 92% of it right. We get about 93% of it right.
Yes.
Because most of foreign policy, you don't see, because it's being handled at lower levels, or it doesn't rise to the level where the people who really make the decisions in this country, namely the mainstream media, pay attention to it. There are also I've discovered, people in government, probably about 97% of them are really good people who care first and foremost about the country. And within the State Department, which is only part of the apparatus, I think virtually all of them are devoted to doing the best things for the United States of America to the extent that they can understand it. And that's also true of the intelligence community and also of the Pentagon, though they tend to have a more limited range of tools at their command. It's also usually true at the place where most foreign policy is made, to use that wonderful thing that, like Betty Crocker thing, where making a souffle, as long as the souffle doesn't fall before it gets to the table. In the White House, they tend to get it right. But I would argue the following. Part of it's education. We have not, since the end of the Cold War, done a decent job of training people in this country to do what we need to do in the outside world. Part of it, we came out of it believing we're number one. We can make things go the way we want. We don't have to educate people anymore, and the things that have to be done. And one subject that is almost inadequately taught virtually, I won't say virtually everywhere, lots of places, is history. Or actually, to begin with, our own history, and secondly, the history of other countries. I say to people, if you're going to try to get involved in some other country in foreign policy, first thing you have to do is understand their history, their culture, their politics, their vision of the world, and if it's compatible with ours, no problem, perhaps. If it's not compatible with ours, you got to find out what's going on. Now, I would argue that one of the problems we have had, not just now, but for at least some period of time, is presidents have tended to be undereducated in foreign affairs. The last time we had a president who had actually done something before he became president was one of my favorites. And as I'm a Democrat and Jim across the road here, we're separated by this great trench called Vauxhall Crescent. He's, I think, a Republican. Tell me if I'm wrong on that. I think you are. The last one I think we had was really good was a man named George H.W. Bush, who had done a lot of things. He'd been at the United Nations. He'd been ambassador to China. He'd been head of the Central Intelligence Agency. He'd been vice president. He'd traveled everywhere. Since then, none of our presidents, prior to becoming president, have really met a payroll. And with due respects to our current president, you don't meet a payroll when you are vice president. You can see a lot, you can learn a lot, you can say a lot, but you take no responsibility because you're not hired to take responsibility. That's the president. Now, I also have one of Hunter's rules. I've been doing this for 6 decades, even though I'm only 40 years old. I started very young. Is that if you're good at something, it's a general management principle. Good at something, do it. If you're not good at something, and you know it's important, hire somebody who's good at it and learn to listen to him or her and them. Listen to them. And one of the problems that has happened, certainly in the last 3 administrations, has been a failure of the president to hire, and that's, if you see 3 presidents, that's 2 political parties, as a failure to hire the best people in the country in terms of knowing how to the extent possible, how the world is put together and what our interests are and how to go about pursuing it. One of Hunter's other rules is when you change parties, and sometimes even within parties, like between Reagan and George H.W. Bush, the new people come in and say, oh, those bunch of turkeys, They don't understand anything. I'm going to change everything. In 6 months, we'll get it all right. 6 months later, they say, those turkeys weren't so dumb after all, because the world doesn't change. The other countries don't change. They, except for a few manipulative countries out there, some are friends, some are foes. They don't give a damn who's the president of the United States. They're dealing with American power and American interest and American influence, and they have to deal with it. Now, one of the problems we have now, and I'm going to use a big concept, is the need for a strategic perspective. People who can think strategically. How do you fit the pieces together? Now, almost all of that now is not done at the State Department because people at the State Department aren't trained to do it. They're trained to do wonderful things in individual countries, but by the time you rise up in the bureaucracy, you don't have people in place who know how to relate problem A to problem B, or within particular problems, how to figure out what the strategy ought to be. That gets moved over in the so-called interagency process under the National Security Act of 1949 as amended, basically to the National Security Council staff in the White House and the Assistant to the President for National Security. Right now it's a man named Jake Sullivan. He's under the President. He's the number one person charged with putting strategy together. The Secretary of State is part of the process, but rarely do you have a Secretary of State who is the central feature. Henry Kissinger was an exception because he had the ear of the president, and for a while he had both jobs as Secretary of State and as National Security Advisor until some people came along and said, Henry, you're talking too much to yourself. You got to have somebody else doing the talking. And so they brought in a man named Brent Scowcroft. In fact, I would argue we have had 3 and only 3 outstanding national security advisors since the job was invented back at the end of the Eisenhower administration. Henry Kissinger, like him or not, did a lot of good things, did a lot of bad things, and maybe even worse if you look at places like Cambodia. Brent Scowcroft, a retired lieutenant general in the Air Force, who himself was not a huge brain, but figured out how to do things, and the other was Big Brzezinski. Now, when you go back, that's a long time since the first 2 are, none of them are now with us, and they're all dead, but they were all very good in part because each of them hired very good people who didn't say yes, except when it was necessary because it was what they believed, but were prepared to say to the National Security Advisor, I disagree with you, or to the President, I disagree with you. I don't know about George W. Bush, whether he was willing to have people say things to him he did not want to hear. I gather Ronald Reagan did want to hear things, even if he didn't want to hear them, but he never had the top level team that we would have hoped that one would have. But I hope that doesn't sound partisan. Brent Scowcroft would listen, and Spig, who I worked for all 4 years in the White House for Jimmy Carter, he would sometimes bridle when you brought something bad news, and he'd question you to destruction. And the next day you'd come in and you find he was using your arguments. You want to find out what you really believed. And in fact, in those days, with those 3 people, the National Security Council staff was only 60 professionals. Today it's 600 professionals, which means instead of being able to relate one country to another, one region to another, everybody's got his own little or her little stovepipe, and you don't get any coordination until you get rushed right below the president. And if you have a president who's in a bubble, and I regret to say that, judged from outside, I think very often President Biden's in a bubble, and I think President Trump brought a bubble with him and never found a way to get out of it. And I'd rather have the Biden bubble or the Trump bubble coming around next time, because this guy doesn't really care. Trump really didn't care about foreign affairs. One difficulty we are now in with Mr. Biden, who I've known almost since he came to Washington, is right now, and Jim, I don't know whether you said this, we have an election coming up on November 8th, something like that. And right now, the single most important preoccupation of Joe Biden is, how do I get reelected to save the country? In his perspective, and that of some other people, I'll let other people decide that. I have a view, but I don't see cataclysm, at least in foreign affairs, if Mr. Trump is returned. In fact, I'll tell you something. Here's a secret, okay? I'll tell you a secret. Came to deal with Russia. Trump was better than Biden.
No.
We can talk about that. He got a bad press, in part because the Democrats, not Hillary Clinton, a lot of the Democrats around Hillary Clinton refused to accept the outcome of the 2016 election. They didn't do what Trump is continually doing. I was stolen, I was cheated, and all that. I'll send my guys up to Capitol Hill to do these things. But a lot of these people didn't accept that Hillary had lost the election. Must have been the Ruskies who did it. That's rubbish. Absolute rubbish. You know, the 3 states, maybe the idea that the Russians were pranking around in Michigan, maybe they know where Michigan is, but I wonder. Okay, and so what do? You try to impeach the president over Russia. Didn't fly. So then what did they do? They looked around for something else and switched to Ukraine. Oh, it's impeachment for Ukraine. Okay, it was a waste of time and set certain kinds of terrible precedents we're having. Okay, I'm happy to talk about individual issues if you want, because I think it's very important, because the 93% that's going right, the 7% that's going wrong is the 7% that right now really matters. And I would say, number one, NATO, Ukraine, Russia. Number two, Israel, Gaza, Iran. And number three, which I don't understand enough about, so I will pontificate. I'm happy to pontificate, but even the Pope tries to stay out of things he doesn't understand. China, I don't understand enough of it to be dispositive, though I do believe in the first two I have something to say, because I have responsibilities in both areas at the top levels of the U.S. government, and I follow them closely up until about an hour ago. One of the problems in the Middle East, classically, another punter's rules, be careful what you say on television about the Middle East, because when the program ends, somebody will come up and say, by the way, did you hear about the following? Everything has changed. But without that now. So I'm happy to talk about whatever you'd like. And I want
James,
to go with my, it's going to be a terrible thing. Jim is going to get ruined in his party. I'm going to get ruined in my party, because 90% of the time we agree. It's a terrible thing. Bipartisanship.
Yeah.
We grew up in bipartisanship. When I grew up in this business, we were bipartisan. That's what you did, because there is not a Republican foreign policy to meet American interests. There's not a Democratic policy that can meet American interests. There's an American policy. American policy.
And this is another reason that we need to confer, but we need to agree to the absolute extent possible, because those that would like to see America divided are laughing all the way to the bank right now. And the more we can be divided, the more it pleases one of the countries that my good fellow here says he doesn't understand, and I'm sure he does, is China. So you see, both China and Russia are meddling in the way we communicate with each other, and they are licking their chops over the fact that Americans can't talk to each other, that we can't agree on policy. And if we can't agree on policy, it weakens the U.S. commitment to securing its own country. And this is exactly what China and Russia in particular are interested in. And as far as I'm sure they're sitting there thinking, well, we're able to accomplish what our foreign policy goals are, and that really for both countries is precisely to weaken U.S. interest and to confuse it and confound it. And this is remember, was it Churchill who said that? No, it was someone more recent, Robert, who said, and I'm not confused. Oh yes, it was one of the individuals running for president, and she said, it was Nikki Haley, and she said Nikki Haley doesn't get confused. If you recall that, I thought that was brilliant. I would like to say that representing our country in the position that it should be in, that we say we are not confused, we are not divided, we are strong, we're unified, and we support the U.S. Constitution and its form of government as the absolute best form of government for the people, and that we will not step away from that. And this needs to be made patently clear to anyone that wants to either meddle with or to destroy our to destroy U.S. The American value and the American way of life. So that is why I think that being able to communicate on the basis of what Robert was saying, and I agree 100%, strategy rather than political, like a political platform, I think it's important that we are unified on a strategic point of view. And if you do this from the standpoint of strategy, you will find that there is greater unity and uniformity in what is best for America. If you really ask that question of people that have two different points of view, you get divergent views. There's no question. But among people who are really learned, as Robert pointed out, we don't have enough of them working in government anyway. And who wants to work in government today? Okay, it's a lethal profession today because you are maligned if you take a position this way or a position that way based on partisan politics. But if you accept the proposition that working in government is service to your country, that is something that we have unfortunately moved away from. Working for and dedicating yourself to a life of service, like George Bush, as you mentioned, he had devoted his life to service to his country largely. He had served in many different points of in different responsibilities, but he was committed to his country. And that is what we need to see more of. We need people who have had experience on the ground, no question for that. But we need strategic thinking rather than political platforms.
Well, I agree with most of what you said. Certainly as ideal. In practice, I think there's a problem. I won't answer for the Chinese, but I think Mr. Putin probably called in his disinformation people and said, I'm going to furlough you, I'm going to fire you because I don't need you to go and sow discord in the United States. They're doing it to themselves. A man named Walt Kelly, who was a cartoonist that maybe all of us are old enough to remember, had a character, a possum named Pogo, and who said famously, "We have met the enemy and they are us." Okay? And if I had to take the four branches of government, we know there's the executive, the legislative, the judicial, and the media. The media is a branch of government, not officially, but unofficially. The most dysfunctional is the mainstream media, because the stuff that is fed to the American people, what was it? Somebody, I guess the head of CBS said a couple of years ago, if it bleeds, it leads. It's about profit, okay? they're out there to make money, and they're going to tell you what's going wrong in the world, and they're not going to necessarily tell you what's going right in the world. And too often now, you get only one perspective. Right now in the Middle East, we're tending to get not a full set of perspectives to educate the American people. And I also fear that maybe at the top levels of the U.S. government, the president doesn't get the full range of alternatives. And maybe some of the people who are working for him don't have the background, the experience, or even the capacity as strategic thinkers to be able to pull it together. And it was obviously true I think it was true under Trump, to an extent under George W. Bush. But we can't afford that. We've got to have a Kissinger, even if you don't like a lot of what he did, a Scowcroft, who might have been the best because he did not have a personal agenda, or a Brzezinski, who had one personal agenda, which sometimes got in the way, which was Russia. But when it wasn't that, he was good. But we haven't had anybody since then leading this process. And so presidents, instead of saying, go get me somebody, or I don't like what I'm getting, reach out. I know that Kissinger reached out to people. Even Johnson, except for Vietnam, and I worked for Johnson as well, used to reach out to people on other issues. Under Clinton, under Carter, that was one of our jobs, was to make sure we were talking to outsiders. We might have missed something. And under Clinton, where I was ambassador of NATO, we did that all the time. In part because you can make a mistake, in part because there are a lot of smart people out there, and in part because you've got to get your policies, once you decide, ratified, to begin with the Congress, and second, with the people of the United States. If you can't bring along the people, you don't have a policy. And it's partly doing the things that the average ordinary person, pretty smart. We have a pretty smart group of people in this country. They're not a bunch of deplorables. I think there was one presidential candidate used that term about certain people. I wouldn't even mention who she was.
I think it was someone who ran for president. But
Yeah.
the thing is, I think it's a wonderful idea, as you expressed and as you did, to confer people outside of government, probably people who were in universities, research think tanks, all that sort of thing. I think that's really important to confer with them. But today, the point I was trying to make a little bit earlier was about the fact that we're already we're really at a digital kind of pass in terms of our relationship with both China and with Russia. So we know that there's a significant amount of engagement in our digital platforms that people depend upon. So yes, it's true. You were talking about the media, but today the major problem we have is an intelligence problem, and that has to do with the information that people are getting digitally. And you can absolutely be 1,000% sure of every day the Communist Party in China and the intelligence apparatus in Russia are working around the clock to provide Americans with disinformation and to provide them with a point of view that is destructive to American interests. So there's no question about that, because we know we see the evidence of it. But I think it's hard for us to accept the fact that it could have a significant impact in our actual policy, but there's no question that it does. And this is something that I think the American government is certainly aware of, no question about that. But I think the American public is naive about it. I think when you look at the whole conflict about TikTok and whether it should be sold or whether it should be completely banned from the U.S., I remember someone saying to me, well, you know, when you think about Chinese intelligence, the Chinese intelligence services, you know that they know more about our households than you could ever imagine. And I said, well, why is that? And they said, because every kid, and not just children, is using TikTok. And TikTok is the biggest surveillance tool that has ever been created. So if you're using TikTok, and if you're creating content for TikTok, or you're watching it, it has access to who you are, where you are, what you look like, what your point of view is. It's probably, historically speaking, the biggest surveillance vehicle that has ever been deployed. So why aren't we concerned about that? Well, because you have economic considerations. You have certainly, you're in a position of, well, can you really force Chinese ownership to be bought by an American company? There are a lot of complexities, but this is something that the American people need to wake up and understand, that in their own households, with their own kids or grandchildren, or perhaps even themselves, using TikTok is a surveillance vehicle.
Well, I think we finally reached an area of disagreement. I don't use TikTok, but I do believe, and this gets way beyond foreign affairs. First, the impact of foreigners manipulating American politics and American attitudes, I think, is pretty small, except in a few areas, and I may get in trouble in a few minutes to talk what I mean. But if I could uninvent one modern invention, it would be so-called social media. It's not, it doesn't take the Chinese to do it. We have Facebook, we have all these other, I can't even remember what the names are altogether, that are interfering all the time. Every time I buy something on Amazon, let's say, or anywhere, and then for the next 2 weeks, I have somebody trying to sell me the same product. Or I go onto something and they say, "Oh, good afternoon, Robert." Oh, hey, come on. The only way to avoid that nowadays, because of what we've allowed to do with one another, is to pull the plug on the computer and go live in a cave. That, I think, is highly destructive of the American democratic process. And that's even before you get to foreign policy. Are we going to do anything about it? No, because the monopoly power of the 5 great organizations has already passed the ability of the United States government to control it, even if administrations wanted to, and even if the Congress wanted to, and even if the Supreme Court would then go along with whatever else anybody else wants to do. We've lost control of this, and we're going to pay a long-term price for it. We're going to have to figure out some way to do it. But that's only secondarily about foreign policy. Now I'm about to say something to get me in trouble. The one area in which we have outsiders genuinely impacting on our domestic policy is in the Middle East. We do not have, in the mainstream media, free and open debate on Middle East issues, and we have not had for some years. In the early stages, in fact, maybe still until what happened with Iran in the last 2 weeks, had much more than we did before, because people could see certain things happening in Gaza. But in order to get this kind of understanding, you got to watch Pete Turner, anybody's watching, or other places, Responsible Statecraft, or I can name some others. During the Soviet Union, they understood they could control 98%, but in order that people wouldn't do terrible things, they permitted a certain small amount of media to exist, and they were called, I'll give you the term, look it up, anybody, it's called samizdat. And that was the capacity to be in this little thing here and a little thing there. And it never had any impact, so they tolerated it. So in a number of areas here now, in the Middle East has been like this, we have become a samizdat culture. You just don't find the real discussion. In the last week, with regard to dealing with the Iran question, you just can't see in the U.S. media a view that gives you the full picture. You just can't. It's just not presented. I happen to think that Iran thoroughly misbehaved. I think the Ayatollah and his predecessors and crew are terrible people. They've done a lot of damage, but they were enabled by a lot of other people. A lot of other people here, and in Israel in particular, did things that enabled Iran to do a lot of what it's doing now. Now I'm in trouble already for having said that, because
Not with me. Not with me.
We have censorship.
You're not in trouble with me, Robert.
Me neither.
I couldn't agree with you more. We enabled Iran, no question.
Yeah. So let me talk.
Let me give you a precise exact thing. We were worried about an Iranian nuclear program, okay, which could create a bomb, which would more than any other country threaten Israel. Not us, except indirectly, because we have a very strong supportive relationship to Israel, values even more than interest, and also some of the other countries in the region. So President Obama came up with a thing, it was a big term, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was agreed by 6 countries back in 2015. The Israelis fought it all the way, even though it helped them. The Prime Minister of Israel, who's still Prime Minister, went to a joint session of Congress. Look it up, it's on the internet. And he asked a member of Congress to be loyal to him and not to the then sitting President of the United States. Astounding. Can you imagine an American president going to another country and doing that? It's just ludicrous. And then they continued to fight it, Israel did, because they didn't want the United States to have reduced tensions with Iran. Of course, the Iranians were happy and go lucky, and they were pushing too. So Trump quit one of the 2 or 3 most important security things for Israel, the JCPOA, to stop the Iranian bomb, and the Iranians were abiding by it. It's on the record. They were abiding by it. Trump quit it, so the Iranians got back in the business. Then Biden comes in, reverses a lot of Trump policies, but not this one. Under the pressure from Israel and its friends, he wanted to renegotiate the whole thing, and now it's dead. So we're now talking about Iran might get the bomb. We had stopped it until the Israelis killed the way we had stopped it. That seemed like a good idea at the time, maybe because it would keep us allied to Israel. Without their understanding, of course, we're allied to Israel in protecting its security. A lot of Americans worked on trying to get something better with the Palestinians. A lot of very good Israelis did this, and a lot of Israelis who were not so good didn't do this. We now have 600,000 Israeli settlers living in the West Bank. And so far this year, these settlers have killed more than 300 Palestinians who happen to live in their homes. That's what's happened. And the Israeli government does nothing. Oh, I'm sure Mr. Biden sanctioned them. They can't come to America anymore. Well, I'm just saying that's one area. We have in the past had an Irish mafia here, which was killed by Ted Kennedy and Tip O'Neill. They just killed it here. We have had some Italian influence. We've had some German influence during the 1930s. We've had other kinds of influence, but nothing. And we had the China lobby run by Joe McCarthy back in the 50s, which people's careers were finished. Today, the only problem we have is we're not allowed to get the full picture of what's going on in the Middle East. And as a result, we might, in the very near future, have a major war in the Middle East, where the ball right now is in the Israeli court as to what they're going to do to respond to what Iran has just done. If they follow what the President of the United States says, try to cool it, maybe the temperatures will go down. If they don't, we could have a major war in the Middle East. Throughout the Gaza war, Mr. Netanyahu has stiffed the American president, insulted the Secretary of State on one of his trips by building new settlements while he was there, which was a deliberate insult to the Secretary of State of the United States. Well, it's not in Israel's interest. And those people out here who try to help Israel despite itself and with the good Israelis, which include most of the retired Israeli security establishment. All right, I've now ruined myself for all time, but over to you.
I want to try to wrap this up because I've got something that's going to happen here at the top of the hour. So let me give you guys each a chance to wrap up on whatever your favorite thing you want to discuss in the next 2 minutes each. James?
Well, as I think we started this, as you know, I'm working on my fourth book, which is called The Rise of Politics and the Decline of Leadership. And that is what we started at the top of the hour, speaking about how politics, if you consider yourself a politician rather than a leader, then you're going to be held responsible to the political platform of your party. And you are going to basically prosecute issues that are critical to the American people on a political basis rather than a policy basis. I think that this is where leadership, if you search today, the entire globe to try and find what I would consider to be genuine leadership, that is where you have devoted yourself in spite of politics to the well-being of the people that you serve, then it's very hard to find any leader in a position of running a country. And I think that this has also bled into the business sector as well. I think that education as well. And I think that the whole idea of what a leader really is, I mean, recently, obviously, with his last book, Kissinger tried to define what leadership is by citing some examples of people who had been in leadership roles that he particularly, that he had relationships with, which is an interesting way to do it. But I think the qualities of leadership, which render a person devoted to serving rather than heading a political party, I think is something that really is needed and should be valued by everyone. And I think we have a lot of work to do to define what it is and put it back on its in a platform of something that we definitely need for the survival of the American way of life.
Thanks,
Well,
man. That's awesome.
Just one word on the policy thing before echoing what Jim just said, I thought very eloquently, and I totally agree with, and that's on Ukraine. Right now, that is the most important national security foreign policy issue for us. It depends absolutely on the Congress appropriating money for arms for Ukraine, which is not just about Ukraine, it's also about perceptions around the world of American leadership. If we can't do that, who's going to trust us if Putin does something terrible someplace else? Who's going to trust us? Now, that has to lead eventually to some form of negotiations on Ukraine. I won't go into that. We don't have time. But in terms of what Jim just said, there are a lot of people out there. And I would like, for example, to take Republican presidential nominee for president, sitting down and say, I'm not going to change who you are, but this election is not going to get determined on foreign affairs. It's going to get determined on economics, cultural issues, etc. How about getting you and Biden off in a corner someplace and agree to fence off foreign affairs and come up with a national policy or a national process so we don't have that screwing things up, and then we'll get back to basics. But there are an awful lot of people out there. So I think, Jim, you said earlier, why would somebody go into politics? You go into politics to serve your country, your family, your community, yourselves. We are an astounding society. We are already coming out of the doldrums economically. We're doing incredible things. We're having to build, quote, build walls to keep people out on the southern border, if that's what we do, not to keep people in.
Yeah.
Happens to other places. People want to come here because we are still, if I may say so, not for the hubristic way of everybody needs to be like us. We're still a city on a hill. And people say there are things about American society and American democracy which is a lot stronger than you hear on television. All the people who have to make money by saying, oh, the woes, democracy is dying. It's rubbish because we've got 330 million people, 329 million of whom are devoted to making the democracy work. It's a small number of people who are making money out of trying to stir trouble. Don't listen to the trouble stirrers. Listen to the people in this particular program and elsewhere, and my neighbor across the street, who work together to demonstrate the potential of what we do in democracy to form a more perfect union. That's what it's all about.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, fellas, listen, I'm going to run these credits. Thank you so much. Don't hang around because I've got to go in the other end, but let's do one of these again soon. Okay.
Good to see you, Pete.
Yeah. Good to see you.
Thanks.
Bye, Robert. Bye, James.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by your